Yeah.
How long have you been collecting?
Probably 10 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
The other side is full of things, so I'll send you some pictures. Okay, so we're let me admit Malik. Okay, think we're ready to go?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. So hello everyone and welcome once again. Today we shall conclude our last and foremost session in our journey to promote for research among a series of 3 productive and motivating webinars brought to you by Kuwait University in collaboration with Northeastern University, Boston. I'm hoping that, let me just admit, Andre, I'm sorry. I'm hoping that we have found this initiative, you have found this initiative useful so far in helping us as a guide in your research work. As you may have noticed in our last session, the topic was pretty new for most of us. And actually, I need to admit some other people. Sorry. I'm closed here. So anyway. Okay. As you may have noticed in our last session, the topic was pretty new for most of us. And that is actually our goal, to bring new content so that we can benefit from the time and the efforts we have put to invest. Likewise, I believe today's session is quite beneficial to all of us. The topic is editorial perspective, peer review, and editorial process, which you will all find interesting, as our presenter will discuss how to manage the review process successfully by covering points such as reviewing and submitting a manuscript by editorial team, revising and convincing reviewers and editors with your manuscript, improving your manuscript to get accepted for publishing. Today's session will be presented by our honorable speaker, Dr. Alvaro Cuervo. He's a professor of international business and strategy at Northeastern University. He received an honorary doctorate from Copenhagen Business School and was awarded a PhD from MIT. He studied the internationalization of firms with a special interest in emerging markets, multinationally, capability upgrading, particularly technological capabilities and governance issues, focusing on corruption and international business. His research appears in leading academic journals such as Academy of Management Journal, Journal of International Business Studies, Strategic Management Journal, and Research Policy. We are glad to have you on board and thank you for joining us. Let me also welcome our guest of honor, Dr. Mirza Hassan, who is joining us today. Dr. Mirza, for those who don't know him, he's the Executive Director and Dean of Board of Executive Directors at the World Bank Group. Prior to the World Bank, Dr. Mirza was Undersecretary of Industry in Kuwait. He held various positions at the University of Kuwait, including Dean of the College of Business Administration. I thank you all for joining us. And before we turn into Alvaro, I would like to ask you that we're going to have a 30-minute, I would like to ask you to tell you about the rules. We're going to have a 30 minutes of presentation. Please mute your mics, turn off your cameras, except Alvaro, of course. Then we'll have our question later on. The guest of honor will comment or add anything after the end of the presentation of Alvaro. Then we'll open the stage for question type or live in the Q&A session. After which we'll have a short survey to be filled before you leave. Let's start, and over to you, Alvaro. Alvaro, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be sharing some of my experience with the editorial process. I'm going to talk about, let me first share this. I'm going to be talking about the process by which papers go through publication, and hopefully here from the editor's perspective you get a different view from what you have already seen before, which was from the author's perspective. So this is what I'm going to be talking about. First, I'll cover a little bit of my editorial experience so that you understand where I'm coming from. My understanding of the group, of the audience, is that you are working in very different fields. So this is international business, but it's management in general. Some of the ideas are going to apply to related fields. You may need to adapt them if you are working in a field that is very different. But nevertheless, the process is more or less very common across journals. And here I'm going to be emphasizing three different topics. Number one, the first step, which is how do you get your paper reviewed? You submit it, and for the most part, many of the papers go into the review process, but about 30 to 40% get at least reject, partly because the editor thinks that the paper doesn't really fit. What I'm going to be sharing is how do you get the paper through this first, if you want, step, so that then eventually you get a revise and resubmit, which is the ideal situation. And then finally, how do you make sure that you get an acceptance of the paper in an academic journal? And then we'll have half an hour to talk about any questions that you may have. So let me start with a little bit of my background. I am a professor, but also I am an editor. I'm currently the co-editor of Global Strategy Journal, which is one of the three journals of the Strategic Management Society. Before then, I was the reviewing editor of Journal of International Business Studies, which apparently is considered the top journal in international business. And there I was in charge of reviewing every single paper that came to the journal. And then I was helping the editor to decide whether that paper had enough merit that it should go into the review process, or whether the paper did not fit the journal or was not very clear, and therefore it will be better that it did not get reviewed. I have also run special issues, 5 of them. 2 of them were in Journal of International Management. And in these special issues, I have acted as editor, getting all the papers, managing them, and then asking reviewers to provide suggestions and eventually accepting some of them. I also have editorial experience on the other side as a reviewer, and that's why I'm going to be using, if you want, 2 different hats in this presentation, one as an editor and also as a reviewer. Academy of Management Journal, Academy of Management Review, Journal of International Business Studies, and Strategic Management Journal, which are again considered some of the leading journals in management. More specifically, a little bit of a Global Strategy Journal, so that you understand some of the comments I'm going to be making later on. The journal is part of the SMS, and as such, it's complementary to a Strategic Management Journal, which is the flagship journal here, and the Strategic Entrepreneurship Journal. Those 2 are in the FT50. GSJ is a much younger journal, but nevertheless, it works very well. It is, if you want, focusing on global strategy, and as such, it is a niche journal that is trying to be a small and high-quality journal. As a result, we do publish a few, much fewer articles than others, but nevertheless, these articles will have an impact. So that's what I'm going to be telling you about. How do you make your papers not only accepted, but also impactful? So this is the review process. It looks long, and actually it is. And these are the different stages. In case you have never submitted, or in case you wondered what happens, what is the black box of the review process. You submit your paper online. That's the first stage. And then there is a managing editor that processes the paper. This is a person who is in charge only on making sure that the paper fits what is the expectation of the journal. In general, he or she does not make any decisions unless there is clearly a lack of fit. In some cases, some people have submitted thesis, complete thesis for a journal, and it's kind of, look, we do not publish thesis. It doesn't really, this is not a place where you should submit your paper, and then that's rejected. Otherwise, the vast majority of the papers are going to come to us co-editors. And then our task is to identify whether the paper fits the journal or not. And this is a very important first stage. Is this a paper that is worth reviewing? Is this a paper that is going to make sense in this particular journal? I'm going to get in more detail in a minute. And the story here is how do you make sure that you sell the paper well so that you get a review? If that is the case, the paper goes to reviewers. So we are now moving in terms of acceptance levels. 60 to 70% of the papers move into the review process, and there it goes to 2 or 3 reviewers. It depends on the journal. In the case of management, this is going to be double blind. The reviewers do not know the name of the authors do not know the name of the reviewers. And this is done with the logic that way you are judging only the paper on its own merits rather than on who is writing the paper. In other fields, this is not the case. My understanding is that many economic journals have a single blind review process in which the authors know the reviewers do know the name of the authors, and there we can discuss the merit of that particular system later on. But here in management, it's always, as far as I know, double blind. From there, they are going to give you comments, and this is going to be evaluated by the associate editor, and then he or she will decide, yes, the reviewers think that there is something here, but there are all these things that need to be improved. I give you an opportunity to revise and resubmit the paper, or look, there isn't really something here that is worth doing it, or it will be taking, it's too complicated to make sure that this is distilled into something that is going to have an impact. The reviewers are highly negative, and therefore you get a rejection. If you get a revise and resubmit, it goes back to you, and you have between 3 and 6 months for the most part. In some cases, it can be extended, improve it, incorporate the comments, then it goes back to the same reviewers, and then you basically repeat the process, usually a couple of times, sometimes 3 or 4 times, which adds, if you want, length to the process. In the meanwhile, the percentage of acceptance keeps dropping. If you get a second revise and resubmit, you are talking about a 15-20% level. So 80% of the papers don't get a second revise and resubmit. And then continue the process, and eventually you fulfill all the requirements of the reviewers. And if you want, the associate editor thinks that, yes, there is something here, maybe it is not perfect, maybe you cannot answer all the reviewers, but there is something here that is worth publishing, and then you get an acceptance, and then it goes through the traditional proof stage. It does get published online, and this is something that is different now. As soon as you get your paper accepted, in a week or 2, it does get published online, but it might take much longer for the paper to get published in the journal. So here we are talking about, in general, relatively good or top management journals, acceptance rates of around 5%, 5 to 10%. And this is something that is important to understand. Yes, your papers get rejected. It's the same thing with me and with the other 2 speakers you had before. It's a very competitive system. But nevertheless, there are a few ideas that can help you improve it. So let's get into them. First of all, how do you get a review, or how do you avoid a desk reject? That's basically the point. First thing, submit the paper to the right journal. And this is something that I think is important. Read what the journal is about. We tend to, in some cases, look at the ranking of the journals and, oh, this is a Q1, this is a Q2, and therefore I'm going to send it to a Q1. And many cases, or in some cases, you just look at the title and, hey, this sounds like it is a good journal, let's send it there. My suggestion, read what the journal says, because in many cases, and this is one of the sources of desk rejections, most of them are desk rejected because the paper does not really fit what the journal is looking for. GSJ is about the strategy. Because it is in the field of international business, we do get lots of papers on international business that don't really fit this narrower field of global strategy. And then we have to say, look, we are sorry, but this is a cross-country comparison. We are not publishing country-level analysis. We are publishing firm-level strategy. Please send it somewhere else. Yes. Yes.
Okay, I'm just checking.
Okay.
Okay.
Then the next one, which paper, which journal do I send it? Who are you citing? And that is going to give you an idea of the people you're having an intellectual conversation. So for the most part, if you're citing lots of papers in Journal Finance, that might be the good journal to submit. If most of your references are coming from research policy, maybe research policy is the journal that you should be submitting. So that's another way of selecting journal. And then who are the authors that are doing work similar to yours? If you are always citing Smith, and Smith is publishing in a variety of journals, those are the journals that for the most part will understand what you're trying to do. So this is one way for selecting the right journal. The next one is fitting the paper to the journal. All journals have guidelines for authors. In general, it's nicer if you adapt the paper to the typical structure that most of the reviewers are going to expect. In some cases, the abstract is going to be shorter. In other cases, it's longer. And the headings and subheadings are done in a particular way. References are formatted in a particular way. The more you match your paper to the expectations of the journal, the easier it is for authors to understand what you're trying to do. Another thing is imitate the structure of papers already published. Do understand that those papers have gone through a review process. They are very different from the initial submission. But they can give you a sense of this is how long, for the most part, the introduction is. This is the length and how people present the hypothesis. This is the type of analysis that are expected. Or in the case of qualitative papers, this is how they present case studies, and then this is the way in which the papers are discussed. An important thing, do not copy paste. That is plagiarism. It does get into a lot of trouble. Top journals, at least USJ and others that I know as well, use an anti-plagiarism software, which when we as co-editors get the paper, we have a percentage of the paper that is the same elsewhere. In general, it's not only a bad signal, but it does create problems with reputation. Not many papers have problems with plagiarism, and that's why whenever we have this type of problems, we end up remembering, oh, that particular person is the one who submitted that paper, and hey, this is not the way to do things. So please avoid a traditional copy-paste. And then connect with authors who publish in the journal. Look at them. Those are the people who, for the most part, might be the reviewers. So try to understand how they say things and what type of thinking they have, and agree or disagree with them. That's up to you, but try to engage with them. And then finally, you have to sell the paper to the journal in the sense that there is a big opportunity. There is a letter to the editor. Very few authors explain this, which is a surprise because here, this is your opportunity to tell the editor, look, this is why my paper, I think, fits your journal. These are the different types of ideas that you have already published, and my paper is building on them. And especially, and this is important, who are you talking to? You can't suggest associate editors. This person, she's an expert on the same topic I'm analyzing, so maybe she is going to be a good associate editor. And this within the editorial review board might be good as reviewers for my paper. Do avoid conflicts of interest. So yes, that was your co-author. You cannot name a co-author or you cannot name somebody from your same institution, but you have the opportunity to suggest editorial review board members and an associate editor. That in general helps the editor understand that, yes, you are actually linking to what we do here. And then clarify the contribution in the same letter. This is important because 2 or 3 points, and that is a very nice signal that you do understand your paper, you understand the journal and the logic for you publishing there. Now, the next step. With this, more or less, you are able to get the paper under review. Now, it goes to the reviewers. They have, for the most part, a month, more or less, to provide comments, and then you get those comments in about 6 weeks, maybe 2 months. Sometimes it takes longer because you have to, as a co-editor, you have to look for several reviewers that do understand your paper. You get it back and then you have to sell it. And this is how do you get the revise and resubmit? First of all, sell the importance of the idea. And this is the title. The title is really important because that's the first thing that everybody sees. In general, core argument and short. This is my recommendation. And if possible, do not include the empirical setting. You don't want to sell a paper because you are analyzing companies in a particular country. You want to sell a paper because you are analyzing a relationship and you argue for something. I just made up this title, how do investors from emerging markets select host countries? That's a research question, and this is a setting. It's much better if then you think about what you're saying, and it is institutional advantage of emerging market multinationals. Much more general, much more direct, and shorter, and it does not include the research setting. Same thing with the abstract. That's the second thing that everybody is going to look at, and this is going to set the stage for all the continued discussion later on. Always start with the research question, and always start in active person. We or I argue in this paper, or I analyze the relationship between this and this. And this is a very nice way to be very direct and identify what you are really trying to do. Don't try to talk about, oh, the literature has done all these things, however, they have problems. That's not the point of the abstract. The abstract is you sell your own ideas, which means that you start with the research question and then you identify the theory. Why this suggestion on the theory? So that this gives the co-editor and the reviewers an understanding of with whom you are talking to and what is your point of view. If you're coming from economics and you say, I'm building on industrial organization, which means is that that's your pure point of view. I'm going to try to understand how you explain things from that point of view. I'm not going to ask you for a different explanation because that's not what you're trying to do. And then your key arguments, which are more or less the hypothesis, but always say, I argue this, I argue that. That clarifies what you say in opposition or in contrast to what other people have said about the same relationship. It's a direct way of presenting ideas. And then the logic, why do things happen? Abstracts can be very short. Some journals have longer abstracts, 200 words. In general, 150, 120 words is more than enough to give, make your point be understood by the readers. Another example I just made up, lots of, as you can see here, analysis of investments from emerging markets, increasing interest in the literature. However, conflict, that's literature review. I don't understand what you are analyzing. Then this is a database, and then this is what I find. I don't understand your voice. I don't see your voice. I do not know what you say. Try to go to the point. We analyze the relationship between these things. We build on this theory. We propose this. This is a much more direct way of presenting things. And then the introduction is the other point in which you are going to sell the ideas. My suggestion, 3 paragraphs. The first one is going to be research question and a very brief overview of what people have said. They have said these things, however, there is a conflict or there is something that is not clear. Second paragraph, what you say. We argue this. From this viewpoint, these are our arguments. If you want some cases, you can mention the sample and the findings. For the most part, unless those are really unique, I don't recommend it, partly because it distracts people from the arguments. And this is also partly because you want people to focus on ideas rather than findings. However, I do understand that in some fields, this is not how it is done. My friends in finance always go to the point of findings because that's what is actually published rather than the story of a theory and then hypothesis, formal hypothesis, and whether there is support for that. But for the most part, try to go directly and make very short introductions. And then finally, contributions to theory and to the topic. In general, when a paper has lots of contributions, it's not really clear what you're trying to do. Very few ideas and very deep ideas, those are the ones that work. How do you clarify theoretical arguments? Always identify the theory, and that's why we have citations of previous work. these authors and especially understand the core arguments of that theory. One or two theoretical bases are usually what works well, because that narrows down the discussion. In management, and this is one of the challenges, it's a broad field from which you can analyze the same topic with different approaches. If you clarify your approach, you are going to get, and this is important, reviewers that are understanding your approach. What you don't want is to cite everybody and this is how you think, and you are getting reviewers from a completely different field. For example, if you're coming from economics, cite economics papers rather than sociology papers, because you might get a sociologist who don't really understand your point of view. Try to narrow it down and always start with the theory and then explain all the relationships. This is particularly important for empirical papers. And here the idea is direct relationships, and if you have moderations or mediations, first the direct relationship, then the moderation or mediation. And then finally, all the arguments. Understand that you say that X affects Y, and there are people who have said that Y affects X. You have to explain the Y affecting S away. You have to get with issues of reverse causality, not only in the empirical analysis, but also in the theoretical discussion. And then how do you convince that the empirical findings are good? Explain in very detail, lots of detail on how you collected the data, what are the potential biases in this database, and where did you get the data? The idea here is that somebody who reads your paper should be able to replicate your process and more or less end up with a very simple, very similar database. And then lots of analysis. And this is important, especially now. Once upon a time, if you look at older management papers, they usually have a relatively simple empirical econometric analysis. Now they have gotten much more sophisticated. What is important in first submission, and this is my recommendation, all the robustness tests that you do, add them at the end. In the published version, you may only focus on a few or the most significant analysis and then only discuss the robustness test. In the first submission, it is simpler to present all the tables. This way you convince the reviewers that yes, actually you do understand what you're doing, you do understand how to analyze those relationships, and you actually do find support for those relationships, and this is not just a matter of the particular method or the particular variables that you chose, but this holds across a variety of approaches. In finance and in economics, you are always going to present every single analysis, and those end up getting published. And then economic implications. And this is again important, and this is to some extent something that we are learning in management from economics. Statistical significance is great. However, and that's only one stage, and the question is, so what, how much does this matter for managers? In addition to finding those coefficients with the statistical significance, the next step is compute what is the impact of that? How much does this matter? If you do this, how many more innovations do you get? If you do that, how much more profitability do you get? If you do that other thing, how much happier your employees are going to be? This is another way to sell the idea that this is a really important paper, both in the arguments and in the empirical findings. These empirical findings do make sense, and on top of that, they have an impact on the world. And then finally, how do you get an acceptance? How do you answer to the reviewer so that you have that conversation with them and then they think that, yes, this is a good paper and it should be published? So first of all, understand what the reviewers are saying. As soon as you get the letter, in general, you read the reviews and you think all of this is so negative. They don't like the paper. They don't like me. What are the problems I made? How is it that they are so negative? You have to understand that in many cases, the role of the reviewer is to try to help you improve the paper. For the most part, they are going to be very positive at the beginning, and then they are going to just tell you a lot of different things that you have to improve. That's mostly the attitude and the role of the reviewer. The role of co-editor or editor is to work with the reviewers to improve the paper. And in many cases, they are going to tell you, especially in the first submission, try to address all of them. Second, on subsequent submissions, they are going to provide you with much more detailed orientation on how you should address, or which are the comments that you should address first and which are the comments that you may not be able to address. This is the story, but first of all, read the comments. Don't think that this is personal because they don't know you. Put it away, think about them, come back to them, try to understand what they are saying and how they are saying things. In some cases, we do get defensive because we think, hey, but we already say this. Why is it that they say this when you think that you already said it? Maybe they didn't read it well, or for the most part, what happens is that because you've been working on the paper for so long, you have thought about it, but it's not really clearly explained in the paper. At the end, the paper is just 30 pages. There is much more that goes into there, but this is a story of understanding from the point of view of somebody external. Why is it that they say this? They're always, in general, it's very rare that the reviewers are aligned in the same direction. In many cases, one is very positive, the other is mild, the other is very negative. You have to identify them, and you'd have to identify the tone and the underlying arguments. And then you have to try to, if possible, please the ones that are the most positive, because those are the ones that are easier, and then try to also address the ones that are the most negative. It is difficult to turn somebody around who has been very negative on a paper, but you can do it. But what you don't want is those who were thought there was something here, then after you revise the paper, they think, well, there isn't really anything here. So you can always work towards satisfying those that think that there is something good there, and then also trying to turn around the people who think that, no, actually there isn't anything here. At the end of the day, remember that there is a long time between submission and revision, so many of those comments that you don't end up remembering, you just look at the paper when it is revised. And then this is important in the letter to the editor, you summarize the main changes. And this is an explanation. It is also a tool to understand these are the three things that we put most of our effort and we made all these changes, and these are the other things that we also addressed. And the next thing is changing the paper. Rewrite the paper. This is difficult because sometimes it takes us a long time to write ideas. But the question here is, be willing to delete everything and start from scratch. And this goes throughout the paper, not just doing a few changes. Oh, they say this, so we change this paragraph. They say this, we change this paragraph. No, this is not a matter of responding to each of them and doing a little bit. This is a matter of rewriting everything so that it changes with those comments. These are suggestions for improvement. And empirical analysis, and this is the easiest part. If the paper is a large sample paper, and this is the easiest part to improve, and at the same time, this is the easiest part to criticize and reject a paper. Oh, this is just holding because these variables, if you try different variables, it doesn't hold. You have to explain these things. And also, if they ask you to do more analysis and you think there are too many or don't really fit what you're trying to do, give the reviewers those analyses in the letter. You don't have to put all the analysis in the paper, but if they are asking you, why don't you analyze subsamples? And it is, I'm not talking about subsamples, but look, nevertheless, these are the subsamples, and these are, you wanted subsamples, we ran the analysis in subsamples, it is still holding. But we nevertheless think that the overall sample is a much better indicator of the relationship. Do reply to every single comment from your reviewers. And then, and this is especially at the important, you need coherence in the arguments and empirical analysis. That's another source of tension for reviewers and editors when you're talking about something and then the analyses are different. You need that level of coherence, which means that if you make lots of changes in the empirical analysis, the theory also changes. If you make lots of changes in the theory, the empirical analysis also have to change. At the end of the day, we as reviewers are reading your final version of the paper. We are not, yes, you have to answer the letter, but we are not putting too much weight on that particular letter. And then, and this is important for the letter, copy paste everything. Rather than, this is a summary of the changes we did. Thank you very much for the letter. On the comments, we made all these changes. take those changes, and for every single paragraph or sub-paragraph, you have to explain what you have done. This is not the point of copying what you have done in the paper and then pasting it in the letter. This is explaining, this is a great idea, however, we think that it doesn't fit. Nevertheless, here are some analyses. This is a great idea. We have incorporated it by changing this relationship or by adding another relationship or by getting rid of that relationship which didn't make sense. Explain what you have done. Don't copy paste the parts of the paper because the reviewers are going to be reading that paper already. And then another thing that is important, you might disagree with the changes. Explain what you are not doing. In some cases, you think, well, this is great, but it doesn't really fit what we are doing, or this is not what we are trying to analyze, or this is really a different story and it will just push us away from our main argument. You also have the opportunity to explain, be nice about it, don't dismiss it. Thank you very much. It's a great idea. However, we think that it doesn't fit. Nevertheless, this might be an explanation in case that in the future we decide to do this, or these are additional analysis in case that other people want to do that particular relationship. This way you are appearing as, yes, comments are good, but for this particular paper, this is a very narrow paper. We're only trying to do this particular relationship. And then finally, prioritize. Who do you have to make happy? Everybody, ideally, but you have to understand that reviewers, their role is to provide suggestions. They do not make decisions. The decisions are made by the editor. And the editor can rely, is always going to rely on reviewers, and that's the peer review process. But at the end of the day, it's very difficult for a paper to satisfy everybody. And in some cases, editors are going to make decisions. They can go with the reviewers and accept the paper. They can go with the reviewers, reject the paper. They might also disagree with the reviewers. In some cases, they might think that, yes, great idea. However, this is not something you can do. Why don't you just acknowledge this is a limitation of the paper, and then nevertheless, we're going to support it. We are going to accept it, and with that particular caveat. From there, some of the reviewers, some of them might not be very positive on the paper all the way to the end. There is nothing wrong with that, and this is part of, if you want, the academic discourse. We do disagree all the time, and disagreeing on particular papers is the same story. But then your role is try to convince most of the people that, yes, there is a good idea here, and it is worth publishing. So this is, if you want, an overview. As a recap of this, how do you get a review? Or in other words, how do you avoid and reject this rejection? Select a journal that is the right journal for your paper. Look at what the journal is about. Look at your references. Look at the authors you are citing. Then adjust the paper to the particular standards of the journal. And that's one way to signal that, yes, you do think that this is a paper that fits this journal. We do get, as editors, many papers that are coming from different places, and it's obvious that that paper was not designed for this particular journal. You are just submitting it. Why is it that you're submitting it here? And also, what is the relationship with us? And then sell the paper to the journal. You can suggest reviewers, you can suggest editorial associate editors that are probably better at managing your paper. The next one, getting a revise and resubmit. How do you sell the paper to the reviewers? And here it is the importance of the idea. The title, the abstract, introduction. That's always what everybody reads first, and that's your opportunity to sell the arguments. And this is arguments, you need to be very direct. We propose this, that clarifies your ideas, rather than talk about literature and relationships. Say it in first person, and try to be very succinct, very direct, very to the point. Short ideas, clear ideas are always better. And then from there, what are theoretical findings, relationships, what is that you expect? Try to explain everything, try to explain away reverse causality, try to first explain direct relationships and then moderations and mediations, and then empirical findings, lots of empirical analysis to show that, yes, I find this relationship and this holds across different methods, different subsamples, different ways of measuring the variable, to make sure that my findings is not something that I just happen to discover because I run a particular relationship, but it's going to be robust across different alternatives. And then how do you get an acceptance? It's working with the reviewers. It is the relationship that you establish with the reviewers. And here, first of all, understand it. These are different people. They've never seen your paper. You've been working on it for several months, several years, and there is much more knowledge that you have than they do. They are reading what you have read. In some cases, there is this problem of miscommunication that you think that you said something, but it's not really clear, and that's what the reviewers are going to be pointing out. Try to understand their point of view and then get into answering all the suggestions, the ones that you agree with, and incorporate them. You can also disagree, and if this is the case, do not incorporate them in the paper, but explain why this is nevertheless a good idea, and maybe in the future somebody can do an analysis. And then finally, how do you improve it? This is the letter. Copy paste all the comments and answer every single one of them, and try to understand which are the ones that are really important for the reviewers, which are the ones that are, if you want, less of an issue. And then try to understand that at the end of the day, there is no perfect paper. And there are papers that are published, but you can always criticize all the papers. The papers that are published at the end of the day are the ones that have gone through a process, and everybody more or less agrees that, yes, there is something here. This is something that is really interesting, and we do have some evidence to support these arguments. So with this, I will leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention. Lots of success, and let me now go into a discussion. So I'm happy to, I'm happy to answer any questions you will have in a minute.
Sure. Thank you, Alvaro. Now, Dr. Mirza, if you have anything to add or comment, please go ahead by opening your, you already did, and so please.
Yes, thank you very much, Mohammed, and thank you, Alvaro. I mean, it's very, very useful. And to many of my colleagues, Alvaro, it's you know, the whole issues of publishing. It's like a black box. You know, there is lack of guidance.
Could you please just turn the camera? Yes, so you can be in the middle of the picture.
Am I okay? Or?
Yes.
So, I mean, it's like a black box, you know, but lack of guidance, you know, how this review process is undertaken. It's unclear to many of my colleagues. But as Mohammed started and you alluded to, Alvaro, the journey of publishing starts with an idea or a problem to solve, and the end of process of it's you know, the publication and the peer review. And it's good to understand the last piece, which is extremely important, and how this is going to work. But also what you said about this arbitrage between the publisher and